Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of the NACDEP Member Services Committee. My name is Peter Wolfhorst. I'm a member of the committee, and I'm facilitating today's webinar, which is Agritourism Success Factors to Entrepreneurship and Community Development. We have several presenters. We have Lisa Chase, Chadley Hollas, and Lindsay Quella from University of Vermont, Dave Lamie from Clemson University, and Singh-Knights from West Virginia University. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to start the webinar.
Thanks.
We have a Q&A, so we're probably all familiar with Zoom. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. You know, if we don't get time to answer them, or if somebody wants to answer them during the presentation, you have that ability in the Q&A. So now it's our turn, Lisa.
Thank you, Peter. And I want to thank NACDEP for inviting us to share our research and our extension program through this webinar series. Could I have the next slide, please? As you'll be able to see on the next slide, we have a multi-state team with colleagues from all over the US that are part of this project. And as Peter mentioned, only a handful of us. We've only got an hour. If we could have taken all day, we would have had everyone present, but since we've only got 1 hour of your time, there are 5 of us presenting today. But we do want to make a point to acknowledge the rest of our colleagues who have been working on this, as well as our funders from the USDA, NIFA, AfriGrant, and AgMark. Next slide, please. Since we put agritourism in the title, we thought we better explain what we mean here, and won't go into too much detail about what is agritourism, but what I wanted to start off with is saying there's a lot of disagreement and different ways of using agritourism. Where there is agreement, as you can see in this graphic here, is in the core, which is composed of on-farm experiences and product sales that are closely tied to agriculture. And there's 5 overlapping categories: hospitality, education, direct sales, entertainment, and outdoor recreation. So that core of this graphic, on-farm experiences and product sales closely tied to agriculture, is where there's agreement. Where there's a lot of disagreement and sometimes controversy is when we get into the peripheral tiers, where you have off-farm activities, or you have activities on-farm that may not be so closely tied to agriculture. And depending on the study and or the legislation, the policy, the community, the zoning, agritourism may be understood in different ways. So what I wanted to say is, for the purposes of the presentation today and the study we are talking about, we are talking about any experience or product sales that happens on a farm. So whether it's an overnight farm stay, a CSA, harvest festivals, pick your own, farm dinners, educational field trips, hunting, fishing on a farm, or even a farm stand that's on a farm itself, we're including it as part of agritourism, including on-farm direct sales. And I should also mention that, you know, in Vermont, I get in the bad habit of just saying farms. We're talking about farms, ranches, vineyards, and aquaculture as well. Next slide, please. We started off the study with interviews and qualitative analysis. This is an integrated research and extension study. So we started off with semi-structured interviews of 25 agritourism operators from 5 different states around the US: Vermont, California, Oregon, West Virginia, and Minnesota. All that was conducted pre-COVID, and we focused on key questions related to perceptions of success, profitability, as well as revenue, and key lessons learned about success. Could I have the next slide, please? Then we used the results from the qualitative analysis combined with literature and past surveys. And I have to give a shout out to quite a few colleagues around the country, including Don Thomani, Carla Barbieri, Brian Schilling. Several colleagues have done excellent work on agritourism surveys. So we use their surveys and the literature combined with what we learned from the interviews to create an online survey. And the timing was interesting in that the timeline for our study happened to fall right before the COVID pandemic hit. So our survey took place in November of 2019 through February of 2020. We used a snowball sampling methodology where we reached out to colleagues throughout the country and asked them, extension colleagues and researchers throughout the country, and asked them to reach out to producers, agritourism operators in their states. We thought it'd be better for someone in California, say, to hear from Don than to hear from Lisa in Vermont. In the end, we did get responses from all 50 states. We heard from 1,834 operators with fully usable responses. And because this survey took place just before COVID hit, it's important to, of course, acknowledge that there have been some big changes since the pandemic took place, and the changes are continuing through the evolving pandemic. However, what we have now is a really good snapshot, a really good baseline of what the situation is for agritourism, including on-farm product sales just before the pandemic hit. And we're planning to conduct a similar survey, potentially while the pandemic is continuing, since it is still continuing, unfortunately, and then after it's over. And we're also looking at expanding this into other countries as well. In this survey, we asked a variety of different questions, and what we're going to focus on today, especially because this is a NACDEP audience, is we're going to focus on factors for success related to entrepreneurship and community development. Can I have the next slide, please? This is just a quick overview of some of the results. We had roughly a quarter, not exactly a quarter, but approximately from each of the 4 USDA regions. And generally speaking, survey respondents were on average around 55 years old. We heard from 58% of female respondents, so a higher percentage than you would normally find in an agricultural survey. And very educated population, 70% had a college degree, and over half of our respondents had been working in agritourism for 10 years or longer. And the medium farm size of our respondents was 60 acres. This is just a sample of some descriptive statistics. At the very end, we'll share with you a website where we have summaries and reports and where we're posting publications and presentations like this one, so that we've got all the information compiled in one place. And now what I want to do is turn it over to the next slide and also to my colleague, Lindsay Quella, who recently finished her master's thesis at UVM and focused on motivations for agritourism operators.
Thanks, Lisa. So as Lisa mentioned, we first conducted some qualitative interviews and then followed up with using the results from the analysis of those interviews to inform our survey. Before looking at this idea of success in agritourism, we first wanted to focus on how do agritourism operators define success. And with that in mind, we did a thematic analysis of all of the interviews, and 3 main categories of goals came up. I'm going to talk about those 3 categories with a special focus on community-related goals. And then using those goals, we conducted an analysis using our survey data to look at if there were any farm or farmer characteristics that were correlated with increased success in meeting goals. So first I'm going to talk about what the goals were from the surveys or from the interviews, and then from the survey. So first was this theme of financial goals. For some, agritourism is a main source of income, and for others, it's more of a side project, but most at least want their enterprises to pay for themselves. However, others are willing to sacrifice income for non-economic benefits. Overall, participants acknowledge that while money was not always the top priority, losing money on an agritourism venture was not tenable for them. So I included also some sort of like key quotations from participants that summarize their feelings around these different goals. A livestock farmer in West Virginia explained that success can come in many different forms, but if someone's losing money, they're not going to be able to sustain it. A second theme that emerged was around personal and family goals. So farmers want to minimize burnout. They want to spend time with their family and find employment for family members. And they want to enjoy what they're doing. And they make strategic decisions about what enterprises to engage in and enter into partnerships wherever possible to share responsibility. Many talked about using agritourism to increase quality of life, in part in order not to get an off-farm job, but also to allow them more time with their family members by remaining on farm. Another key component of some of the motivations for agritourism was that having visitors to their farms breaks up rural isolation for those of the participants who are in rural areas, and provides positive encouragement and feedback from visitors that makes them feel appreciated and valued. So this is another quotation from a berry grower in Vermont who expressed, the money part, it's fiscally rewarding, but to interact and hear positive things that visitors say about the farm, because it is nice because it reinvigorates your purpose, it's affirming, and it's an ego boost. Next slide, please. And the third sort of like emergent theme was around community-related goals. Many farmers defined their success via their role as educators. So they're observing a US population increasingly disconnected from their food sources, fewer farmers who are integrated in non-farming communities, a decreasing number of farmers in general, and increased public concerns about food safety and agricultural practices. And what participants talked about was they really see themselves as direct intermediaries between consumers and their food sources. And agritourism is a venue for them to be those intermediaries. As public figures, they consider themselves advocates for and teachers of their particular version of agriculture. And they also see themselves as community leaders, both for the public and for other farmers. So again, here's a quotation from a livestock farmer in Oregon. It's more than just profits. It's important, as she said at the end, it's important that the voice of the ranchers and the farmers, the real people that do the work, be heard by the majority of the people who don't. So in terms of, community development, these findings really critically highlight the role of community engagement and leadership in agritourism operators alongside of these farm viability goals. So I just wanted to focus on that a little bit because I think what we found was, potentially using a community development lens or toolkit in supporting agritourism operators would be really successful. Next slide, please. So as a follow-up, in our survey, we asked 2 questions related to motivations and goals. We asked first for respondents to rank the level of importance of 8 different goals, from not at all important to very important. And then we asked them to rank how successful they feel in meeting that particular goal. As you can see, over 90% of respondents felt that increasing farm and ranch revenue was important or very important to their agritourism operation. A large percentage of respondents felt successful in achieving these community-related goals, such as education, social interaction, and building goodwill. And that I just felt that was important to highlight, given what I just said about really the emphasis on these community goals. And we were really happy to see that respondents feel that they're successful in meeting those goals. Some less successful goals were related to farm viability and market-related goals, such as increasing revenue, diversifying market channels and offerings, increasing traffic to on-farm sales, and providing family employment. So generally, respondents felt they had been successful, although community-related goals were sort of notably more successful than the others. Next slide, please. So using the least successful goals, so the ones where operators were the most mixed in terms of success and non-success, we ran an analysis, statistical analysis, seeing if any, to explore the relationship between farm and farmer characteristics and perceived success in achieving these goals. So basically, we're sort of looking at of the respondents who feel they are successful in meeting their goals, are there any characteristics in common, and vice versa with those who are not successful in meeting their goals. And these are just some of the sort of highlights of the results of that analysis. So when we looked at respondents based on gender, and acknowledging that gender is not binary, but the majority of our respondents were women and men. Women who offered experiences felt more successful, while men who offered products, especially value-added products, felt more successful. So that was a very interesting finding, that sort of the way that those things divvied up based on gender. We also found that on-farm sales was a variable that came up a lot for women who felt successful in meeting their goals, especially those who were closer to urban centers. Operators interested in increasing revenue should consider offering accommodations and lodging. We found that that was also a variable that had a positive association with success in increasing revenue. We also noted that experience had a stronger relationship with perceived success than education. And so what that means is that operators who had more years in agritourism were more likely to feel successful in meeting their goals versus those who had more education. We also found regionality played a role in successfully diversifying farm and ranch offerings and increasing traffic to on-farm sales. And then finally, things that didn't come up, acreage and number of days open to visitors had very little effect on perceived success overall. And so one thing to note is that this was, we asked farmers how successful they feel in meeting these goals. So one question that came up is there a relationship between perceived success and actual increases in revenue? And so my colleague Chadley Hollas is going to speak to that question and also dive a little more deeply into the relationship between agritourism and farm revenue.
Thank you, Lindsay. So we did find that farmers who, there was a positive relationship between farmers who felt successful and those who were successful with increasing revenue. We're gonna, Lindsay talked a lot about the perceptions of success, and we're gonna look at one sort of relatively objective measure of success, one measure of success, which is increasing revenue. So those who wanted to increase revenue and felt they were successful at it actually most likely, more than likely did actually increase their revenue. Here you're just looking at a distribution of all of the revenues reported by our respondents. This is by, I believe, almost all 1,800 of them. But you can see that the green bars represent the total farm revenue, and the dark green line represents revenue specifically from agritourism. And you'll see that the pattern, there's a sort of a similar distribution with regards to how the revenue amounts are distributed. And then there's 63% of the respondents fell within these three bars, the two gold bars, with revenues between 5,000 and 250,000, and 58% of the respondents fell between those, the 5,000 and 250,000 in agritourism revenue. So the majority of the respondents fell between these levels. And in the next slide, we're going to look at agritourism profitability. And I left the revenue slide in the back there, just so you can sort of see the differences. You'll notice that 26% of the respondents reported no profit, but 74% did report a profit. And there's no clear winner with regards to the level of profitability that operators reported. It's a relatively, I wouldn't say an even distribution, but it's sort of spread out around the other options, whether it was less than $1,000 or even up to almost 500,000. And you'll see that very small percentages of our respondents made over 500,000 in profit. And that speaks to sort of, I believe, the size of farms that we had, sort of smaller scale farmers, not the large agritourism operations that you see in some places. And so, you know, another large part of the survey was trying to figure out what factors might lead a farm to higher profitability. And this is a very brief summary of some of the relationships that we found. We found that female operators, being a female was negatively associated with profitability, meaning that if you were a female operator in this survey, you were more likely to be less profitable than the male counterparts. Off-farm direct sales was also negatively associated with agritourism profitability, and note that this is for agritourism profitability, not total farm profitability. And so our suspicion with that is that off-farm direct sales results in sort of starving, or it's the negative association is a result of starving the farm of resources it might need, whether it's staff or just time spent on that. And then we saw positive relationships between a couple of different activities that farms offered. That's events and entertainment, as well as on-farm direct sales. But the highest, or I guess the most strongly correlated variable was being motivated by revenue, which is a good thing. People who wanted to make money seemed to actually make more money. And then also those people that, interestingly, I think, but those people that were motivated mostly by social interaction, that was also positively correlated to profitability. So there's a lot of other factors that we looked at, and we've talked about some of those, and my colleagues after me will talk about more. But these are sort of the strongest relationships that we found with regards to profitability. The other variables we looked at were distance to a city, how many visitors you had, how many days you were open, all those sorts of variables. And we found other relationships as well, but some of them weren't strong enough to mention here. Yeah, so with that, I will pass it off to Dee, who will discuss some of the challenges.
All right, thank you very much, Chadley. And so as part of the study, we inquired about the various challenges or barriers to success for agritourism operators. So here are the issues that respondents identified as either very challenging or somewhat challenging. And each bar here represents the percent of our respondents. So Operators across the US mentioned time management as one of their biggest challenges, as well as labor, concerns about liability issues, and some of the issues you see mentioned here. And while many of these challenges are faced by all agricultural operators, respondents noted that regulations and taxation issues they experienced, along with the lack of available insurance, makes agritourism a difficult enterprise. And availability of insurance either due to the cost or coverage for various activities that they offer. Slide. So we further broke those challenges down by region, and what you see here are the challenges that were found to be statistically significant within that regional analysis. So most of the challenges deal here with federal, state, and local regulations, as well as funding sources and community opposition. So in the next few slides, I'll take a deeper dive into the top three here: liability, state and local regulations, and e-connectivity. And as we look at the regional differences, we really want to consider these challenges the way operators generally view them, through the lens of what we're calling access. So we can ask, how accessible are the resources needed by agritourism operators to be successful? Slide. So before moving into the data, I want to take a moment to explain the concept of access and what that would mean for designing appropriate educational strategies for possibly for your clientele. This concept was developed in 1981 to include 5 dimensions to explain access. The concept was reworked by one of our colleagues on this project, Wei Wei Wang of UVM. And also that was part of her dissertation work to look at access to resources for agritourism operators. So ideally, access means that all the 5 components seen here are in play. That is, that resources are readily available, they're acceptable, or they meet the operator's expectations, they accommodate or are adapted to local needs, they're affordable, and they can be physically accessed. And so while, having all of those elements is not often the case as far as resources go, we can safely say that the more dimensions that are met, the greater the likelihood of access. So again, we're asking, what is the accessibility of resources needed by agritourism operators in order to be successful? Slide. So the first, as I said, was liability, and liability impacts the way a farm operates in terms of the activities it can accommodate. The biggest issue faced across the US was indeed liability. Overall, 81% of respondents felt challenged by liability issues. And regionally, the West Coast experienced the most challenges with liability, with 87% saying it was indeed challenging. Respondents further indicated that most of the liability issues are as a result of issues either with visitor behavior or with a lack of or the high cost of insurance. So relating that to accessibility, as far as insurance is concerned from the operator's point of view, there is generally a lack of appropriate insurance options. And then what is available is either costly or not suitable to the needs or expectations of operators. Slide. So as far as state and local regulations, these are also a barrier to success for operators. Overall, in the US, 72% of respondents felt challenged by issues of regulations. And again, on the West Coast, 83% of operators find the regulations to be a major challenge. So while it is slightly better in other parts of the country, most still find it a major issue, owing either to the vagueness of regulations as applied to agritourism or conflicting messages regarding state and local regulations and which one trumps which. So again, in terms of accessibility, there is an abundance of regulations, but operators find accessing the rules difficult. Often they have to go to multiple agencies to sort of uncover those. The cost of compliance is generally high, and the regulations that are in place sometimes mismatch with the needs of operators, or the regulations do not work the way that operators were actually made to understand that they would work. Slide. As far as e-connectivity, overall, 60% of operators are challenged by e-connectivity issues, but it is a major issue, or more of a major issue in the South, where 69% of operators find it challenging. E-connectivity has significant implications on several things. So on the ability to market reliably online, or to run credit card payments, or to communicate with customers and other stakeholders, or even to seek out educational and operational information like farmer education or those regulations we talked about, or even finding acceptable insurance. One farmer in the South called their need for reasonably priced and reliable service as crippling. That's how important it is. So, and although the survey was conducted pre-COVID, the increased dependence on e-connectivity since March of 2020 will likely make it an even greater challenge for those operators without access. So again, coming back to that issue of access, in many locations, e-connectivity is not available, it's not accessible, and when it is available, it's generally really costly. Sometimes the quality is low, and some companies do not appear to accommodate or to make accommodations for areas where agritourism operations are located. And so that sort of compromises or presents challenges for agritourism operations. Slide. I also wanted to mention some additional challenges that operators brought up. That includes, time to connect with visitors, as they juggle their farm operations with, tending to visitors. Managing visitor expectations was also a challenge, especially among those that have, these idealistic expectations of their farm visit. And operators are also dealing, sometimes with the trade-off between scale and capacity and with financing their infrastructural needs. Slide. So overall, there is a positive outlook for agritourism from these respondents. Almost 70% of operators indicated an intent to expand their operations, either with more employees or with capital investment. 20% indicated that they will hold steady where they are now, while only less than 5% indicated that they would, reduce or close their operations. And then the graphic on the right shows the percentage of respondents requesting supports. The top 6 supports are listed here. The top 3, basically social media marketing and management, basically to improve communication, legal and liability information, again, to mitigate their risks, and then marketing plan development, sort of to enhance, their overall business model, and their need for website management, resources for locating operations, and then safety information overall. Slide. So moving forward, this is important that service providers and researchers, sort of consider all of the dimensions of resource access that I spoke about as we work with our agritourism operators. Our support for agritourism operators basically, should be focused on the issues we mentioned: social media management, legal, liability and regulation issues, as well as marketing plan development, and those issues of e-connectivity. Support should be tailored to the goals that were indicated as difficult for operators to achieve, specific to their region, whether that's increasing revenue or increasing traffic to on-farm sales outlets, or diversifying marketing channels and so on. And then also support should focus on finding ways to monetize their social goals. Partnerships and alliances, or what is being referred to as agritourism clusters or agglomerations, they can help overcome many of the inherent challenges to entrepreneurship and profitability that individual producers face. But these clusters can also simultaneously help overcome some of the geographical and infrastructural challenges that many rural areas face. So I'll hand it over to Dave Lamie to round out the presentation. Dave?
Thank you very much, Dee. I'm going to take us in a little bit different direction. A good part of my career has been focused on rural development and community economic development issues. And it's only in the last decade or so that I've kind of moved more back into agriculture. And we've had institutional changes where I am that kind of required some of that, but also I think it is kind of a natural bridge here between the community development professional world and agriculture. There are some places where that happens, where there's these bridges that are just kind of naturally there. And agritourism for me is one of those. Local food system development is perhaps another that's somewhat related. And so I want to ask a few questions of my community development extension colleagues, who I assume are out here in the audience. And I'm going to put them in the chat. I'll also speak them. And we don't have a platform here, I don't think, where you can come in and interact with this directly verbally. So I'm going to ask you out there in the Q&A or the chat. I guess it's the chat, isn't it? I'm going to share it with everyone. My first question, I put one out earlier, but I'm going to send you a different one now. So I want to try to get at, if you're looking at your own state situation, if you saw the opportunities and the challenges that are associated with these agritourism entrepreneurs who have potential for leadership, for community engagement, for helping to create more vital, robust rural economies, if you will. I think any extension professional needs to kind of understand how do I engage with that group, and how do I incorporate that into my programming portfolio, if you will. And one of the first questions about here is, how robust is your portfolio of resources available to help support agritourism entrepreneurs, within your state? And at the federal level, the state level, but with an extension, do you have nonprofit organizations that are operating in this space? Or is there anything else that's kind of going on in your state that you think is an important element in terms of the support base for supporting these entrepreneurs? And I'm seeing in the Q&A that looks like there's a way to either type an answer or to answer live. Am I mixing the two platforms here?
Yeah, you are. There was a question in Q&A, and I know there's some discussion going on in the chat between you guys. So I don't know if that we can ask that later, based on that conversation I saw that several of you were putting in the chat. But they are different. I mean, if somebody wants to speak, if they raise their hand, I can give them audio rights. Why don't we do that and attempt to have that format? But
yeah,
not, I
there
guess.
Are a couple.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say so Dave, you're asking this to everyone. You're asking, how robust is your portfolio of resources available to help support agritourism entrepreneurs, federal, state, extension, nonprofit, other? Probably the easiest way for everyone to give a response is to type their responses into chat. If there are people who are unmuted, as Peter said, they can raise their hand, and then Peter has the power to unmute them and they can chime in. But why don't we just open it up for folks to put their answers into chat?
Yeah, and if someone feels like they really want to speak, then we'll give that opportunity. Looks like Brian figured out what to do, and so did Martha.
And while people are typing into chat, if you don't mind, why don't we take a minute to answer the question that came in while Chadley was presenting, which is, do you know why there is a negative correlation between profitability and being female? And I think Lindsay wanted to take a shot at answering that. And I'll just put it out there that it's a really good question. And as panelists, we'll take a shot at answering it through our research and what we've seen in the literature, but we want to ask all of you that question as well.
Yes, I very much would be interested to hear if anyone else has theories. So we haven't specifically looked at the answer to that question is sort of the short answer, and the longer answer is that there has been previous research related to gender and agritourism that suggests that men and women define success differently and prioritize goals differently. That may be a part of it, although it seems like from the regression, there's more going on there that is definitely worth investigating. Also, what came to mind was that regarding the literature on women entrepreneurship, that women entrepreneurs are more likely to reinvest revenue in their businesses compared to men, which then shows up as decreased profitability compared to men. So that's a potential reason, but worth exploring more.
Yeah, it was interesting for us to see that finding, but not surprising because it's something that has consistently shown up in the literature that being male and being white is associated with higher profitability in agritourism and in, as Lindsay mentioned, entrepreneurship in general. So it's something that we want to continue to look into and dig into with our data. And one of our colleagues, Claudia Schmidt, is spending some time looking at the gender differences, along with actually another colleague at Clemson, Lori Dickey's. So we hope to have a better answer from our data, but we also, also want to open it up to folks. Feel free to, along with answering Dave's question, type your, what your findings and your experiences with that question into chat.
Yeah, and I've seen we have a couple of responses, and I think this is what we kind of expect to find. I know in some states they have agritourism associations, and it looks like Colorado is saying that they have one there. I know we do in South Carolina now. I think in some states, even amongst the panelists here involved, you don't have that resource available yet to bring your agritourism operators together on a regular basis so that they can kind of put together their agenda for. Sometimes it could be policy change that they're looking for. Sometimes it could be just organizing good educational training events so that you can come in with extension programs and things like that to a less fragmented audience, if you will. So I think a lot of states are kind of the beginnings of that sort of a development. I asked another question out here, and this is kind of a follow-up to that. We have a group here. If you're seeing several of them present, you saw a list on the beginning of the presentation. There's more of us involved in this particular effort. And there are other people involved in some agritourism research and extension training across the country. There's also some folks that we're working with on a more international scale on related to agritourism. And I'm just wondering, what kind of access do you need to, as extension professionals, to the work that's coming from this research and other work? What form does that need to come in? What kind of access would be preferable to you? Are you interested in engaging in any of that related, say, applied research, at least related to agritourism? How would you like to participate in that? So a number of questions there that feel free to chat them out again, or if you want to raise your hand and talk about it a bit, this would be the time to do that.
One thing I'll mention is when you type into chat, you have the choice of selecting all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So if you're, and I think the default is all panelists. So if you're willing to share your responses, we've got some good responses coming in. If you're willing to share your responses with attendees too, make sure you select all panelists and attendees.
It looks like there's a question in the chat to the panelists. Dave, do you want to field that?
From Brian Gwynn. Can you provide an example of partnerships, alliances, or clusters of agritourism that overcome several of the challenges identified? hopefully a diverse cluster rather than a common sector, such as a cluster of wineries. I think maybe it's partly what I just mentioned there at the statewide level. Now, they aren't necessarily the kind of geographic cluster that might take a sub-state region where there's a real concentration. And I'm seeing the reply up there from Jennifer that kind of speaks to this, say in a particular location like in the Teton Valley, where you might bring together a number of agritourism operators that have common interests. They may be quite diverse in terms of the types of agritourism operations that they're participating in. So I think the statewide associations are oftentimes a place where, you know, I'm not sure if there's yet enough evidence, a lot of evidence that what they're doing is making these huge differences, except the reason they organize oftentimes at the state level is to try to change state level policy. Now, some of the other panelists may have some examples of where some of these clusters have developed, people have organized at a different level. I have seen them in a region here in the PD region of South Carolina that created a regional agritourism association. And part of the purpose there was to, you know, they were working with the local tourism convention visitors bureaus and that sort of thing. And they were trying to create enough of a agritourism presence, if you will, so that they could become more of a destination for people that were wanting to escape Myrtle Beach and get out to something, in my opinion, that's more interesting. I think they had some success with that in terms of attracting the people who would typically go to Myrtle Beach, or at least for a part-time visit out into another region of the state to offer something different. The rest of you have other things you might want to add to that?
Yeah, I can add from a more very micro perspective, some of the experience we've had with, let's say, one of our clusters, our Mountain State Maple Days, which is a partnership with our maple syrup producers, as well as the Department of Agriculture and WVU Extension. And what that involves is basically 2 days, one in February, one in March. We sort of open up what we call these sugar shacks, because, you know, maple is sort of a new and upcoming thing in West Virginia. And so these sugar shacks are open, but a lot of these are really remote. You know, you can find some, as we say, down the holler. I never remember if it's down the holler or up the holler that West Virginians say. But anyway, it's a really remote areas. So one of the things we do is we encourage them to sort of do this in partnership with other businesses in the area. So I'll use one that is in our northern panhandle. It's Family Roots Farm. They're a sugar shack. And so they sort of have this partnership with other businesses in the area. One is a bed and breakfast, so you can bring people in the night before the event, the weekend. They partner with the local farmers market to sort of offer start the day off with a pancake breakfast, serving local maple syrup. And then they have another sugar shack that really showcases the different varieties of products that they make. And then you end up at Family Roots Farm. They show you the process of tapping and creating all of these wonderful, and how you boil the syrup down and create all these wonderful byproducts. And then you end the day, I think there is one other event, one other stop, and then you end the day of all things at a Mexican restaurant, right? This is just one example. And why a Mexican restaurant? Because it's kind of one of the only restaurants in town, but you need to eat. And so they kind of feature this maple, you know, maple on their menu. So it's kind of one of these micro kind of niche clusters where you get people in the community to sort of partner with agritourism activities to sort of act as a magnet to pull people into that area where something is going on. So a lot of these niche sort of micro clusters happening all over, but that's just one example.
I can share an example that is maybe where they begin to scale up such things, is that in South Carolina, there was a project that started a number of years ago called the Ag and Art Tour. It's a self-guided tour that's, you know, quite well organized. There's a lot of work behind the scenes with a committee structure in the community to set up basically over a weekend, 2 or 3 days in a row. at the county level, they're organized for people to go out and visit agritourism sites. They have a little passport they check off, which ones they've visited and that sort of thing. People can go out and kind of self-select, the specific sites that they would like to go to. And it's brought a lot of first-time visitors out to these individual agritourism farms. But again, it's kind of a clustering approach or strategy. That started out in one county, and I think now it's in something like 17 or 18 counties in our state. Kind of a program is going on. If a community is willing to invest in that kind of volunteer leadership behind the scenes, then they can access kind of the branding and marketing and whatnot of the program and the structure and some engagement from our extension personnel to help them with that effort. So I guess that relates as well. We do have a question here in the Q&A, and people were asking about someone asked about successful funding sources for regional or state agritourism associations. And I guess the only one that I really know is the one we have here in our state, and that's a membership-based organization. The fees are quite low, but it's subsidized typically by an in-kind staff contribution. The State Department of Ag has a person who actually helps to support that association and basically serves as their executive director. Anyone else have any examples that they might want to share?
And that's an open question. Feel free to type into chat and share what's happening in your state. In Vermont, it's been a mix of membership fees and grant funding. And the challenge with grant funding is it comes and then it goes, and somehow you got to keep it working. So pairing with our state Agency of Agriculture and our Vermont Department of Tourism and Marketing has been helpful, but it's been, it hasn't been easy to keep that sort of statewide level of support at a consistently high level, which is where it needs to be. It sort of, comes and goes depending on different priorities and, different ideas as politicians come and go.
There's a really important question out there in the Q&A right now about, how seriously is agritourism being taken by economic development folks and regional development folks. And I'll add a couple thoughts to this, and I'm going to turn it wide open to anyone else out there that wants to jump in on this for sure. We've had some luck, at least here in this state. I've been working with our councils of government, at least some of them, which are regional councils. Every state has these. They're multi-state organizations, or multi-county, organizations within all of your states, working on kind of agriculture and food system and related kind of strategies as part of like their strategic planning for economic development for the Economic Development Administration. Every 5 years they go through this. And we've had some, and I've been in touch with the national level organization. I know that there's at least 30 or 40 of these out across the country where they've actually put in place goals and strategies for regional development that can include things like agritourism. I don't know where it has become, say, the highest priority in any particular community or county. I think it's part of the mix in terms of small business development strategies and entrepreneurial system development and that sort of thing. But maybe others have seen something different or more pointed.
There's one more question that I'm seeing in the Q&A, which is a research question. You received responses from more than 1,000 farmers. How did you approach so many farmers? Traditionally, our farmers are very reluctant to answer any research questions, especially about their finances and revenue. We ended up using a snowball sampling methodology where we reached out to extension colleagues and researchers that we work with in all 50 states. And so we really look to you folks out there to say, hey, will you share this with producers in your state? And the reason why we kept the survey open for 4 months from November to February was because, different states had different approaches and some states were a little more proactive than others. in terms of reaching out to producers. In the end, we did hear from all 50 states, but in some cases we only got a handful, less than 10 responses from a bunch of states. And then we had other states that, had a much more participatory population of producers and were more likely to answer the survey. So I think when we do this again, we'd be looking to make even stronger connections with not only our colleagues, but the producer associations in each state and really try to get the word out that way. What would be ideal is if we had a listing. In some states like Vermont, I have a listing of the producers that would qualify, have agritourism and on-farm direct sales for this survey. So I was able to reach out directly to producers. However, we didn't have that for many of the other states. So we were relying on newsletters or Facebook posts or however different colleagues wanted to share the word about the survey. And I think, what I've heard back is from some colleagues in different states, they wanted their specific responses pulled out and were disappointed that they hadn't heard from more producers in their state. So I'm expecting that when we do this survey again, especially states that are interested in having their data pulled out and a little more engagement, we'll probably get a better response there. Do any of my colleagues want to add anything to that?
That sounds about right. It seems like different folks who work with agritourism operators in different states, some of them have very active listservs, is my impression, and others not as much. And so I think what we saw was that for the states where there's a lot of active engagement between technical support or whomever and producers, there were a lot more responses. So yeah, like you said, it varied a lot.
Another question, Kate, which is how did you get a list of agritourism producers in Vermont? Who compiled the list? We compiled the list. We compiled the list. The UVM research team was working with the Vermont Farm to Plate network and other Vermont associations that sort of pulled together. I mean, the nice thing about working with agritourism operators is they want to be found. So they're, for the most part, publicly listed and their contact information is available, but it's a matter of taking the time and having the effort there to pull everyone together.
Lisa, I can add one little bit to that. In other states, something to think about. There's a project that I've been involved with for a number of years, Market Maker, which is more of a food sector, food supply chain related project. But several years ago, I helped them to develop a profile for agritourism enterprises that some of those producers that might be food producing farmers might also have. And so within that system, if you're in one of those market maker states, there are profiles there. And if it's been promoted within that state, especially to agritourism sector, you might find that there are some listings there within that website. If you go out and Google food market maker, you'll probably find that site. If not, feel free to send a note to me and I'll help you out. The other thing is, I think any of those states that have a state agritourism association, that's part of the benefit. They typically have membership directories and that sort of thing. And so facilitating research, once you kind of get rid of these scattered, almost anonymous kind of entities that are out there and they begin to self-organize, all kinds of benefits can flow. So if there's one thing I know about community development extension people is they know how to organize people or encourage them to organize. And so I think, that's this organizational development piece is another niche I think that extension folks in your program area can really add value to.
Yeah, I guess one final question. I know John, one of my colleagues at Penn State's asked a few questions. We just had a webinar on comprehensive economic development strategies. So that's why I was asking these questions because, agritourism may or may not be part of that economic strategy through that agency that's doing it, either at LD, local development district, or an economic development district. But he wants to know other universities beyond land grants waiting in education about agritourism.
More-
Any
We are seeing that. Patrick Holliday at Troy University comes to mind. And, you know, I've been hearing from non-extension colleagues, so to speak, around the US and in other countries as well. I think getting back to that question of how seriously agritourism is taken as a community economic development, I think we still have a ways to go for it to really be taken seriously, but it's come a long way. You know, when I started working in this area 20 years ago, you know, it was nothing. We wouldn't even have a conversation about how to define it because people had never even heard of it. So I think we're moving forward and more people are getting involved, but there's still a lot more work to do.
I think related to that, within the land grant universities themselves, oftentimes, especially within extension, we have extension directors who came from areas of production agriculture, who may not have a real strong appreciation for the community development area. They may not understand it or have really been properly educated, let's say, in the values of that program area. We've seen challenges in many states. I think this is one particular niche, working with agritourism, that allows NACDEP members like yourselves to do something in a sector that really plays upon your skills, but in a sector that is really close to agriculture, and it gives you some talking points and a story to tell with your administration. So I encourage you, if there's an opportunity in your state to weigh into this, that this, you know, this might be one of those niches that would be beneficial if you find yourself in those kind of situations. I have before.
I think we've reached the hour. I appreciate everybody who was on this webinar this afternoon. I appreciate our presenters. Thank them for sharing their research with us. And like you said, hopefully those that are here today can take this information and use it in their respective states. We're blessed. Our extension director at Pennsylvania has a community development background, so we're kind of blessed.
Yes.
And we have a small team there, but we're blessed with him having that knowledge.